welcome you to Palau Macaya. The activity will begin shortly. Please make sure your mobile phones are turned off. Thank you very much.
Bona tarda, buenas tardes, benvinguts y bienvenidos al Palau Macaya, Centro UNESCO. Muy bienvenidos también a las personas que nos seguís en streaming. Me presento, soy Josep Uller, el director del Palau Macaya de la Fundación La Caixa, y continuando con la programación de los ciclos que para este 2025 hacemos conjuntamente con UNESCO, hoy presentamos la mesa redonda ¿Quién paga los costes? Cómo afrontar las desigualdades causadas por el cambio climático. Y lo hacemos a propósito del informe que hemos copublicado UNESCO y la Fundación La Caixa con este mismo nombre. Sin más, doy la palabra al señor Sergi Lugni, director general adjunto de Asuntos Corporativos de la Fundación La Caixa. Muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes a todos. No me alargaré porque, primero de todo, welcome to our speakers. We have to hear you, and that's our reason to be here today. Yo os doy la bienvenida en nombre del presidente Fainé, presidente de la Fundación La Caixa, que hace un año y medio, conjuntamente con Audrey Soleil, la directora general de la UNESCO, inauguraron este centro. Inauguraron el Centro International UNESCO Center for Social and Human Science. Y para nosotros es importante, porque en definitiva compartimos el mismo compromiso y propósito que la UNESCO en educación, cultura, ciencia. Y hoy hablaremos de cómo afrontar las desigualdades causadas por el cambio climático. Pero quería hacer también una especial mención a toda la gente que trabaja en nuestra fundación. ¿Por qué la Fundación La Caixa? La Fundación La Caixa es una fundación única en Europa. Una fundación que está para hacer el bien, para estar al lado de las personas. Una fundación que tiene un motor económico, que se llama Criteria, pero que es el fin para poder transformar socialmente la sociedad y hacer a bien a las personas, con programas sociales, programas culturales, becas y un centro de investigación que abriremos pronto, a finales de este año, que es el Casa Research Institute, que será uno de los mejores centros europeos para la ciencia, tecnología y por el tema de humanidades. Y todo esto se hace gracias a personas con vocación, a personas que tienen las ganas y la vocación de trabajar en una fundación especial. Especialmente en este centro aquí tenemos al presidente del Club de Roma, nuestro amigo Jaume Lanaspa, a Pep Puyé y toda la gente del Observatorio Social que día a día hace posible que la palabra de la Fundación se pueda expresar en sus publicaciones o con la publicación de hoy la UNESCO. Mónica, Emma, Silvia, María, Gustavo, Arantxa y tantas personas, que me dejo alguna, que estáis en el día a día del centro, de poder hacer esto posible. Yo no os voy a decir nada más, creo que empiece la mesa redonda y pensar sobre el cambio climático, obviamente que afecta a toda la gente vulnerable. Lo que vimos en la Dana fue un ejemplo de ello, pero también pensemos qué hacemos nosotros, cada uno de nosotros, socialmente, porque todos hablamos siempre de la facilidad y del humanismo, pero ¿qué hacemos cada uno de nosotros humanamente por las personas y qué hacemos cada uno de nosotros por el medio ambiente? Muchísimas gracias y bienvenidos.
Muchas gracias. Doy la palabra al señor Gustavo Merino, director de Políticas Sociales de la UNESCO.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Es un gusto estar aquí con ustedes en Palau Macaya de la Fundación La Caixa para lanzar este informe que aborda tanto los impactos desiguales del cambio climático a nivel mundial como el de las políticas públicas que tenemos y son necesarias para enfrentarlo. Lo que queremos presentar hoy ante ustedes no es solo un reporte de investigación, es un recordatorio para los tomadores de decisiones públicas que para lograr que las políticas ambientales y climáticas sean efectivas, necesitamos que sean incluyentes y justas desde el inicio. El cambio climático, lo sabemos ya muy bien y tenemos muchas advertencias al respecto, no es una amenaza lejana, es una realidad que ya estamos viviendo. Aquí en España lo hemos visto de manera muy clara en los últimos años, con olas de calor récord, inundaciones, sequías prolongadas, incendios devastadores. Y como queda patente en el informe, los eventos extremos están volviendo cada vez más frecuentes y severos. Hoy en día, 3.600 millones de personas, o visto de otra manera, casi el 45% de la población mundial, viven en regiones altamente expuestas a los impactos climáticos. Y si las tendencias actuales continúan, hasta 1.200 millones de personas, o el 15% de la población mundial actualmente, podrían ser desplazadas hacia el 2050, según el Instituto para la Economía y la Paz. Ahora, estos no son números abstractos, son datos científicos que tenemos frente a nosotros. Ahora, así como el cambio climático tiene impactos desiguales entre distintas poblaciones y regiones, también las acciones ambientales implican una carga desigual y como resultado podemos tener una doble carga que frecuentemente afecta de manera desproporcionada a los más vulnerables, la carga del cambio climático y la carga de cumplir con las acciones para enfrentarlo. Ahora, esta doble carga es una preocupación central del informe y un llamado a la acción para repensar nuestros marcos de políticas sociales y ambientales para que nadie sea dejado atrás. Cuando las políticas climáticas no se diseñan con un enfoque de equidad, pueden alimentar una sensación de injusticia, provocar reacciones políticas y, en última instancia, socavar el apoyo a la acción climática necesaria. Ahora, hemos visto esta dinámica en distintos países. En Europa, por ejemplo, el movimiento de los Gilets jaunes en Francia o los chalecos amarillos ilustró cómo las políticas destinadas a reducir las emisiones exacerbaron las disparidades sociales, generando protestas. Y hemos visto protestas similares contra diferentes acciones como los impuestos a los combustibles en Ecuador, por un lado, en Kenia, por el otro, solo por citar unos casos. El informe se refiere a estos y a otros ejemplos que muestran de manera clara que si queremos que las políticas ambientales funcionen, estas deben ser justas e integrar a los más vulnerables desde un principio. De lo contrario, corremos el riesgo de debilitar tanto la cohesión social como la agenda climática en general. Además, por supuesto, de aumentar las desigualdades y la vulnerabilidad. Y bueno, pues se ha hablado mucho del cambio climático y cómo gestionar las transiciones más inteligentes. Pero creo que una contribución importante de este reporte que presentamos y la investigación que lo respalda es conectar dos enfoques que a menudo se mantienen separados, y es la realidad científica de los eventos climáticos, por un lado, y el impacto social, por el otro, de las políticas destinadas a abordarlos. Y esto es precisamente el trabajo que la UNESCO y la Caixa se proponen apoyar, que une ciencia y política pública para diseñar soluciones más justas y efectivas. Palau Macaya, ya lo decía Sergi hace unos momentos, es un centro UNESCO de las ciencias sociales y humanas, es el primero en España y es un espacio ideal para que esto ocurra, vinculando la investigación y el debate público. El informe de hoy es un paso adelante en esta dirección. Ofrece evidencias y recomendaciones de políticas diseñadas para fomentar una transición más justa y más equilibrada. Ahora, el camino que tenemos por delante no es fácil, pero pensamos que con investigaciones sólidas y evidencia y un debate y una reflexión podemos informar mejor las políticas y mantener estos temas centrales, cruciales en el centro del debate y proveer soluciones más justas e inteligentes. Entonces hay que seguir adelante con ello y hacerlo juntos. Voy ahora, si me permiten, a pasar a nuestro panel que tendremos hoy, a la mesa redonda, y vamos a tener el gusto de tener a tres ponentes muy distinguidos, excepcionales, que van a aportar sus conocimientos y experiencia en la conversación de hoy. Y los voy a ir presentando. Primero tenemos a Sandrine Dixon de Cleve. Ella es copresidenta y actual embajadora global del Club de Roma y presidenta ejecutiva de Earth for All. Es una voz destacada en el ámbito del desarrollo económico sustentable y las políticas climáticas. Anteriormente presidió el grupo de expertos de la Comisión Europea sobre el impacto económico y social de la investigación y la innovación y formó parte de la misión de la Unión Europea sobre cambio climático y adaptación. Tenemos también a Karima Kadaoui, que es cofundadora y presidenta ejecutiva de la Fundación Comunitaria Tamkin para el Desarrollo Humano de Marruecos, quien tiene una amplia experiencia en los sectores privado y público y social, por supuesto, y nos va a aportar una visión sobre la importancia de mantener una visión holística y de comunitaria en el diseño de las políticas públicas. Y tendremos también a Rodolfo Lassi, quien es el autor principal del informe Quién asume los costes, que vamos a presentar hoy, quien nos va a hablar sobre los principales hallazgos y datos. Rodolfo tiene amplia experiencia en la materia y él ha sido enviado especial sobre asuntos climáticos ante las Naciones Unidas y fue director de Medio Ambiente dentro de la OCDE. También fue viceministro de Planeación y Política Ambiental en el Ministerio de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales de México y pues tiene una sólida experiencia y amplia en gobernanza y climática y políticas ambientales. Entonces quisiera invitar Sandrine, Karime y Rodolfo, por favor, que pasen aquí al frente. Y bueno, pues muchas gracias. Vamos entonces ya a empezar con los comentarios de Rodolfo Lassi, que en sí es el autor principal del informe que hoy se presenta. Rodolfo, por favor.
Sí, bueno, nosotros preparamos una breve presentación, no sé si la puedan proyectar, por favor, para mostrarles algunos de los resultados y cómo es que nosotros empezamos a manejar la información estadística a nivel global, como bien decía Gustavo, de lo que son las proyecciones climáticas al periodo 2040-2060, digamos al 2050, y las estadísticas en cuanto a crecimiento poblacional y condiciones socioeconómicas que se esperan en los países que precisamente están siendo pues, afectados por el cambio climático y con una granularidad que nos permite distinguir aquellas comunidades que son más vulnerables, en especial a los fenómenos hidrometeorológicos extremos, ¿no? Estos huracanes, estas inundaciones, estas olas de calor. Entonces, ¿van a pasar la presentación?
Yo tengo entendido que sí.
¿Sí? ¿Pudieran ponerla, por favor? Y si no, bueno, pues la comentamos. ¿Todos tienen el reporte?
Demos unos segundos
¿No?
para...
Ah, bueno, entonces yo creo que vamos a tener que poner la presentación. Pero les comento lo siguiente. Normalmente los temas climáticos se abordan desde la perspectiva de Naciones Unidas en un consenso que se construye por todas las naciones y el fenómeno ha avanzado mucho más rápido de lo que nosotros esperábamos cuando se hizo la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas en 1992. En 1992, por poner solamente dos casos, se hablaba solamente de 6 gases de efecto invernadero y en realidad el IPCC empezó a investigar y a sacar reportes sobre lo que ahora conocemos como 12 gases y compuestos o grupos de compuestos que tienen efecto invernadero. Entonces, el Acuerdo de París, pero empezando por el Protocolo de Kioto, habla solo de 6 gases de efecto invernadero y no considera a los contaminantes climáticos de vida corta, que son forzadores climáticos, y esa es una agenda pendiente que tenemos en la gestión climática global. El metano es uno de ellos, lo estaba yo comentando con Sandrine, pero también es el ozono troposférico, o son las partículas negras de hollín, el carbono negro, que son forzadores climáticos, tienen graves consecuencias para la salud pública, tratándose de contaminantes en áreas urbanas, y no están considerados dentro del Acuerdo de París. Entonces, aunque lográsemos reducir estos 6 primeros gases que están en el Acuerdo de París, todavía nos faltan otros 6 más para poder reducir. Pero estos 6 que nos hacen falta, que son los contaminantes climáticos de vida corta, nos pueden ayudar a evitar llegar a puntos de no retorno, los tipping points en el clima, ¿no? Otro aspecto importante de las gestiones climáticas es que se ha puesto demasiado énfasis en mitigación. Casi el 70-80% del financiamiento climático se dedica pues, a comprar las nuevas tecnologías o a instalar las nuevas tecnologías para producir energía, para desplazarnos sin contaminar. Y estamos hablando de paneles solares, calentadores de agua solares o generadores eólicos o automóviles eléctricos, autobuses eléctricos. Y no se dedica mucho presupuesto a las medidas de adaptación. Como se adelantaron los fenómenos hidrometeorológicos extremos del cambio climático, pues hay muchas comunidades que ya están sufriendo a estas fechas. Bueno, lo vimos en Valencia recientemente. El reporte habla de un caso dramático, que es el fenómeno, digamos, que ha causado mayores daños en el planeta históricamente, que es la inundación que se dio en Pakistán en el año 2023, afectó a 33 millones de personas de un país de 280, y 8 millones de personas se tuvieron que desplazar de sus lugares de origen porque no tenían condiciones para seguir viviendo ahí. Entonces, hay una necesidad urgente de los países, pero en especial en las comunidades vulnerables, de invertir en infraestructura para que esas comunidades no solamente enfrenten estas nuevas circunstancias climáticas y que además sean resilientes, o sea, sean capaces de recuperarse porque tienen la infraestructura y digamos, la economía funcionando de tal forma que pueden recuperar su vida normal o volver a la normalidad después de un evento dramático como el que vivieron, por ejemplo, en Valencia, ¿no? No tenemos todavía esas condiciones en los países asiáticos, que son los que mayormente están afectados precisamente por estos fenómenos, y van a tener condiciones sumamente desproporcionadas en cuanto a los impactos del cambio climático al año 2050. El reporte identifica geográficamente dónde viven esas personas altamente vulnerables, porque están en pobreza extrema, y es muy fácil que en un evento de esta naturaleza caigan en la desgracia y tengan que emigrar. Y entonces estimamos nosotros 239 millones de personas que simplemente no la van a hacer en el año 2050, no van a poder superar sus condiciones de pobreza y tampoco van a tener posibilidades de ser resilientes. Si migran, ahorita lo vamos a platicar, ¿ya puedo poner la primera lámina? Ah, perfecto. Si migran, pues se van a exponer a otros riesgos y ahorita déjenme platicar. Déjenme ver si puedo poner la primera lámina. No. Si no, yo les sigo platicando.
Sí. Natalia, no, de la computadora no pueden mover la…
Ahí está. Bien. Lo primero que van a ver en el reporte es que el reporte está dividido en dos grandes apartados. El primero es dónde se van a dar estos cambios geográficamente y en qué poblaciones. Porque a la pregunta de quiénes son los más afectados y qué costos van a tener, no hay una respuesta todavía en la Convención Marco. Entonces nosotros tratamos de abordar esta pregunta desde la óptica de UNESCO y la Fundación La Caixa, porque precisamente son organismos que se dedican a ponerle atención a aquellos aspectos sociales que a veces pasan desapercibidos en situaciones pues, globales que de alguna manera están trastocando nuestra vida cotidiana. Y luego, ¿cuáles son los impactos distributivos de las políticas climáticas? Ya lo mencionó Gustavo. Nosotros decimos, bueno, pues hay que tener nuevas tecnologías, ¿sí? Como los autos eléctricos, pero resulta ser que le dejamos a las fuerzas del mercado que desplacen los autos eléctricos y lo hacen pues sacando autos eléctricos que son más caros que los de combustión interna, cuando producirlos es mucho más barato, pero lo hacen precisamente en el sector aspiracional que les permite detonar el retorno de inversión más rápidamente, sin considerar que es una solución climática que se debe de masificar. Entonces, pues hay un problema de efectos distributivos de esa naturaleza. Entonces, nosotros estamos viviendo una nueva normalidad que se adelantó, que esperábamos a la segunda mitad del siglo XXI, pero que ya está presente, ¿no? Estas anomalías de temperatura y de precipitación que están asociadas también a fenómenos prácticamente impredecibles, ¿no? Pues nos introduce una condición de vulnerabilidad a todos los habitantes del planeta. Algunos están más preparados que otros, por ejemplo, con sistemas de alerta temprana, que es una de las recomendaciones que nosotros tenemos en el reporte. pero no existen sistemas de alerta temprana para todos los países. Inclusive países como España, pues en un fenómeno que ocurre en menos de 30 minutos, simplemente pues cobra vidas, ¿no? Entonces, el reporte dice con toda claridad que hay un derecho no escrito de los habitantes de este planeta, que es el de saber si tu vida está en riesgo en los próximos 15 minutos, porque de eso estamos hablando. Y muchas veces, pues, los países pues, no tienen satélites, no tienen información de sistemas meteorológicos locales. El huracán, por ejemplo, que afectó recientemente a Acapulco, no lo pudimos predecir con rapidez porque simple y sencillamente no tenemos boyas marinas que midan la temperatura del océano, que es el que está acumulando calor, y entonces no había posibilidades de saber en qué momento iba a entrar a costa y en qué momento iba a destruir toda la infraestructura hotelera de Acapulco, como lo hizo el huracán. Este es un esquema que simplifica esto que les estamos explicando, Gustavo y yo, y entonces sí, hay un acuerdo de París, sí, el acuerdo de París ha sido muy exitoso en movilizar voluntades, en activar sectores que eran altamente contaminantes y hacerlos menos contaminadores del planeta, pero esas fuerzas que nos podrían sacar a la población, digamos, más pobre del planeta de su condición socioeconómica de vulnerabilidad, son menos, digamos, intensas que las fuerzas que de alguna manera pueden sumergir a estas poblaciones vulnerables en una pobreza trágica, ¿sí? Entonces, hay grandes contingentes humanos en África, en Asia, en Latinoamérica, que están expuestos no solamente a los fenómenos climáticos, sino también a violencia, ¿no? O sea, a conflictos violentos, a problemas de migración económica y a nuevas circunstancias económicas derivadas de las políticas climáticas, como son los impuestos al carbón, o como pueden ser la deuda externa de los países que tienen que adquirir tecnología limpia de otros productores, ¿sí? Y que, bueno, pues ellos, como no la producen, como no tienen las patentes, pues es un costo adicional a sus economías el poder tener un futuro climático con esta neutralidad de carbono, que es el nuevo paradigma y la nueva meta que tiene la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas. Nosotros, les decía, creamos índices de exposición al cambio climático, mezclando la información científica con la información socioeconómica de múltiples bases de datos. Es el primer ejercicio que se hace de esta naturaleza a nivel internacional. Y sobre ese nivel de exposición analizamos sectores específicos, como por ejemplo las mujeres, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos nosotros una granularidad que nos permite decir, bueno, pues va a haber 1.400 millones de mujeres que van a tener que migrar, tal vez, porque ya no existen condiciones de viabilidad para su existencia en donde están actualmente viviendo. Cuando migra una mujer en una zona pobre, rural, tenemos una circunstancia excepcional. Los hombres, por lo general, en zonas pobres, están trabajando en las ciudades o han ido a otros países para poder mandar ingresos a sus familias. Y entonces la mujer se hace cargo de los niños, de los ancianos, de sus bienes, y tiene que protegerlos y los tiene que alimentar, y además tiene que desplazarse de un ecosistema que conoce y del cual puede sacar alimentos a otro que desconoce. Entonces, esa es un poco la condición que actualmente estamos. Entonces, las zonas afectadas las estamos mapeando por todo el planeta. Desarrollamos también un índice, no alcanzo a ver aquí, pero bueno, este es el que yo les comentaba que produce esta estadística de los 239 millones de personas que simplemente no van a tener condiciones para superar esta circunstancia, y se van a ver expuestos los migrantes pues, a otro tipo de violencia, ¿no? Abusos, trata de blancas, efectivamente una explotación mucho mayor, y van a perder sus posibilidades de generacionalmente superar sus condiciones socioeconómicas. Las mujeres, les decía yo, son particularmente vulnerables, y sucede también que, por ejemplo, cuando migran las familias, las niñas dejan de ir a la escuela. Son las primeras que dejan de ir a la escuela y entonces se vuelven o se exponen a otro tipo de violencias y condiciones, abusos, ¿no? Nos importó mucho la parte laboral, la parte de los trabajadores, porque hay una transición energética e industrial hacia nuevas tecnologías limpias. Y entonces pudimos mapear también por primera vez cuáles van a ser las condiciones de los trabajadores, por ejemplo, a temperaturas extremas en distintas regiones del mundo, y cómo estos trabajadores, pues para seguir produciendo alimentos en el campo o edificios a nivel urbano, pues van a tener que superar condiciones de temperatura muy adversas. Y eso pues también nos lleva a un índice de exposición laboral que nosotros mapeamos, y bueno, estamos detectando que 760 millones de personas es posible que no puedan seguir trabajando o haciendo lo que hacen porque el clima no se los va a permitir al año 2050. Se trata de no dejar a nadie atrás. Ese es uno de los paradigmas de los objetivos de desarrollo sustentable. Y tenemos algunas conclusiones y recomendaciones de política que ahorita podemos profundizar con nuestras invitadas del día de hoy, en la cual, bueno, pues tenemos que lograr que al menos en el 2030 se cumplan las metas de los objetivos de desarrollo sustentable, ¿sí? Tenemos evidentemente que invertir más en adaptación, como ya lo había dicho, no me repito, abordar los impactos distributivos de políticas climáticas para ser incluyentes y escuchar a todos los sectores que van a ser afectados o que están siendo afectados por las políticas climáticas, poner en la lista de prioridades a los más vulnerables primero, ¿sí? Hicimos un breve análisis de los sitios patrimonio UNESCO, como este, pero que están en riesgo o que van a estar en riesgo, y detectamos 289 sitios que, ¿sí es así? 38 sitios que van a estar en riesgo al año 2050 y que no lo están actualmente, ¿no? Entonces hay que salvaguardar eso. Y tenemos recomendaciones precisamente para hacerlo, pues con políticas avanzadas en términos de cambio climático. Pero una que en particular es importante para los países en desarrollo, porque queremos hacer una aplicación masiva de nuevas tecnologías y que sean limpias, es que haya transferencia tecnológica, ¿sí? No podemos esperar que los países en desarrollo utilicen, por ejemplo, autos eléctricos si no se producen en su país, si no se genera riqueza, empleos verdes y nuevas formas de hacer crecer la economía sin afectar el medio ambiente. Pues muchas gracias. Traté de ser sintético.
Muchas gracias, Rodolfo, por presentarnos un resumen de este estudio que espero todos puedan leer eventualmente. Y voy a empezar ahora a preguntar a nuestros dos panelistas, lo voy a hacer en inglés, por si alguien prefiere ponerse el traductor. Vamos a empezar con Sandrine. Sandrine, thank you. You know, you have vast experience on these topics, and I wanted to ask you, what strategies can help ensure that fairness and equity are built into the climate transition policies from the beginning, rather than waiting until you have the double burden that we spoke about and resistant to unrest to these practices? And also, how can we convince policymakers that tackling climate-related inequalities should be a central priority?
Thank you so much for that question. And let me first commend you on this report, because it's absolutely fundamental, and I think it's spot on in terms of the analysis. As you know, Gustavo, through the Club of Rome and a project, Earth for All, which we actually undertook some system dynamic modeling, which we do through the Club of Rome, to look at the interrelationship between poverty, inequality, and climate change. Through that, we actually came to very similar conclusions. So the first thing I want to say is I think there is a culmination of analysis which is demonstrating that we will not hit our climate targets, we will not decarbonize, if we do not take care of justice, fairness, inequality, and poverty. So that's the first. And I think there are a series of really important elephants in the room that we need to bring out when we have conversations with policymakers. And this is how we also summarized our policy recommendations. The first big elephant in the room, it's not only just the disparity between North and South. It's that we have growing inequality in the North. We have more inequality than we've ever seen. And we're seeing that across the globe, most of the wealth is staying in 10% of the population. And that 10% has the greatest impact in terms of climate emissions because they consume more and they burn more emissions. So one of the first key policy discussions that we have with policymakers at the UN level, but also at the national level, is you have to tax wealth. You need to tax windfall profits, in particular from the most extractive industries. Fossil energy industries are making $2.8 billion per day in windfall profits since 1970. And just in 2022, 130 billion was made by the top 5 Western companies. So we have to figure out a way to tax those profits, both in terms of the wealthy who are getting away with not paying, and the more and more we see that the wealth is being made through technological solutions, cyber solutions, etc., the more that wealth is not taxed. So often what we're saying is there's a perversity in the market. And what we're saying to policymakers is you say transitioning is too difficult. There is no capital. But what we're saying is, yes, the capital is there, but actually it's going to the wrong places. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is how do we ensure that the financial architecture that we have in place, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are actually really addressing the other key elephant in the room, which is debt. In the Global South, we will not see investment in either the technologies that we need or in adaptation because most countries are asphyxiated by debt and they can't pay off that debt. So debt cancellation, which is a proposal now in front of the IMF and the World Bank, and also at the UN level, is being addressed as a real option. There are other possibilities, debt for nature swaps, for example. So that's the second key issue. The third is how do we ensure that we don't continue to see that affordability for people in the transition is the problem. So when we speak to policymakers, we're saying if you continue to increase the price of decarbonization and you put that price on people rather than, again, taxing the brown industries, those that are making the most profit from our economy, then people will continue to get angry and they will not join this just transition that we're talking about. So we really have to make it just. And then finally, I would say that we need to change the narrative. And this was part of what Earth for All was about. We showed that we could move from a business as usual scenario, which is creating all of the problems that we've just seen, the stresses on the most vulnerable people, compounded by conflict, and we know we will have more and more conflict when we have more and more climate change. And yes, women are the most vulnerable. And the more women are not educated, the less they're part of the economy. The less they're part of the economy, the more they have babies, the more we have population issues, and the more we have migration, more and more people that actually will continue to create stress points. And less women that can be part of a fruitful care economy that is part of the regular economy. So these vicious cycles are perpetuated as we move forward. And these are conversations now that we're having, but we have to figure out how do we have these conversations in a world that is focused on what we call techno-feudalism now, especially coming from the United States, where there's an obsession with AI, which will make things even worse, because actually the more AI we have, the more demand for materials and molecules, especially fossil energy, we will have. We need to very much look at how we can create new partnerships, solidarity between the Global South and at least the European Union. And what does that look like? This is problematic when we see that our development aid is being cut as we speak. Not only USAID, but most of the member states across Europe have cut their development aid and are now investing in defense. So I think these big elephants need to be taken into account. And I'll bring in the last key elephant in the room, which is really the big systemic elephant. If we continue to only focus on productivity, we will continue to have emissions. We will not actually, in time, invest in adaptation in the way that we need to protect people. But it will only perpetuate the current system of the wealthy are getting wealthy. And this means that we have to move beyond GDP. And really, now we have the biggest argument we have ever had for buffering GDP. And that is analysis that is coming from scientists and economists that at 1.5 degrees, and Roberto talked about the fact that with climate change, and in particular 1.5 degrees, we are now in 1.5 degree world, we will already lose this year 3% of global GDP. And at 3 degrees, and we are on a pathway to 3 degrees, we will lose upwards of 10 to 17% of GDP. So for me, the argument for policymakers is, why would you continue to only focus on GDP if you know that no matter what you do, it will continue to increase climate change and you will continue to lose GDP? We have to buffer this with different types of indicators. Adaptation indicators, resilience indicators, access to healthcare indicators, access to hospitalization, social indicators, and social tension indicators. And you and I, and I'll finish with that, we're at the Wellbeing Economy Forum in Iceland, and we talked about how do we actually shift to a well-being economy, which is exactly what we did in Earth for All. We showed that by putting in place a giant leap scenario, taking into consideration everything that I've just said, you can shift to a well-being economy, and it will only cost you 2 to 3% of GDP. So it is feasible, possible, we have the solutions to do it, but the key question is, at this time, do we have the political will?
Thank you, Sandrine. I mean, you do raise I think you raised these big elephants in the room. We can't overlook them. The issue of inequality, debt, affordability. They need to go beyond GDP and try to find new measurements, new partnerships. All this is key and indeed very much in line with the questions addressed by the report. So you make a very compelling case here. Now you're making this look at these big aspects, and now we'll turn to Karima, because precisely you have a lot of experience in community work and directly looking, how to get, the question is how to empower people to become drivers of climate change. So we need to change all these institutions that Sandrine was saying. But now, Karima, how do you think we can empower people to become drivers of climate action, given, of course, the significant difference in how climate change affects different groups or people depending on their gender, ethnicity, country of origin, where they live, the socioeconomic status, and others? Please.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. I'm so delighted to be here. I told you, I really loved the report because for me it was very much a widening of the gaze. Let's look at climate action and climate policy from one specific perspective, but let's try together to widen the gaze and see what happens there. What are the solutions that we see as solutions today that if we widen the field of possibility of thought, we start looking at them, maybe they're going to be problems, or create new problems that we have to confront in the future. I'm delighted to be with my colleague, the Club of Rome colleague, because we're both members of the Club of Rome, which is wonderful. I just wanted to add that Temkin Community Foundation for Human Development is very much, we call it in Morocco, the mirror for not only communities but systems, to recognize the beauty there is in the community, in the system. And when we recognize the beauty, we realize it. And this so we have partnerships with the education system, the higher education system, the justice system, with different systems and communities. And that process, when we have villages coming together, co-imagining, and they call it like that, let's imagine together with what we have, what can we do? But this happens from a deep human connection, a deep human relationship. Something happens. There is this moment like, I didn't realize that we were like that. Yeah. There is something that us human beings, we are able to recognize, and it's a recognizing of the heart, which is those moments where we deeply connected to the other, where we see anew our own communities, where we see anew our own systems. Those are the moments when it happens in villages and in neighborhoods and in schools and at the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Justice and other systems such as youth or culture. This is the moment that we recognize a common essence. And when there is this common essence that we are talking about in this report, justice, fairness, those are all elements that takes us back to our human essence. We realize we are very good at recognizing when something is not just. Since we were small, if we are punished unjustly, we recognize it very quickly. Yes. This is something that is in us, that is inherent to our very nature, fitra in Arabic. So I will share with you an experience, a shared experience that we have experienced in villages, but also at the levels of the ministries, is if we have a group of people and we say we're going to separate the group in 3 groups, and we are a social ecosystem, and we tell them that each group has a mission, and those missions concern these chairs that you have here. You cannot communicate with each other, with one another. You cannot tell the others what is your mission. So each group are given different missions. After a while, they start. So one group has to create the chairs in a circle. The other one has to turn upside down every chair. And the other one has to organize the chairs in pairs. If we just say this, invariably what happens, Gustavo, is that people start fighting. The objective, the mission takes over. We suddenly do not have winners and losers. What if we are hated for that? Suddenly do not have winners and losers. What if we are able to have policies that are able to bring us together? So I'll go back to this experiment, to this experience and shared experience. So after a while we say stop, and it's so funny because when there is the bus with like pulling the chair with the other, and they're looking at each other, and suddenly somebody recognizes his boss, he lets go of the chair. Some people let go, some people run with the chairs and start boycotting the process. When we said what happened, they say it's impossible. We cannot do this because the objectives contradict each other. And I said, but are you sure? And then they start thinking. Now, if the same group of people, we tell them each group has a mission, and this is your mission with these chairs. But beyond the mission, you have an amana, a responsibility. You are entrusted with the harmony in the social ecosystem. So you have to fulfill your mission, but remaining in the responsibility and in the amana, in the trust of the harmony of this ecosystem. The harmony of the ecosystem meaning we all flourish together. Invariably, people find extraordinarily creative ways and different ways to achieve the objective. So what is lacking here? To be able to do that, and we've done this at the level of ministry, and develop villages, and it's invariably the same thing. When people connect, and they feel this deep human connection, and they recognize that there is a beauty beyond what they have seen so far in their community, then we start realizing that beauty, that shared humanity. So here, what do we need to do to bring beyond the instruments, the policies, the ideas and the propositions, to bring something else? And you have said it here. What kind of, not policy, but meta-policy, a policy of policies that makes us all understand, yes, we have objectives, economic, social, environmental, but we have something, all of us, wherever we are, whatever community we come from, whether it's the top of the mountain, or whether it's New York, or whether it is in the Moroccan desert, wherever it is, our responsibility is to water and nurture this human harmony and our ability to co-flourish together.
Thank you, Karima. You really you make a powerful statement about the human element, the importance of connection, of shared humanity, and I like that you started with saying that, well, we all instinctively recognize we're very little when something's just or unjust, the fairness of things, reminds me of the Rawlsian experiment that clearly shows this. So thank you, and that indeed combines very well with the issue of changing the institutions we work with and so on, and addressing the big elephants that Sandrine was talking about. Now, Rodolfo, I will turn back to Spanish. En el reporte ya incluía algunas recomendaciones de política pública generales, pero imagina, tú tienes amplia experiencia como funcionario público a nivel nacional, internacional también. ¿Qué recomendarías personalmente a algún funcionario nacional o internacional preocupado por los impactos injustos del cambio climático y las políticas climáticas? ¿Qué le recomendarías o qué le dirías, básicamente?
Bueno, déjame refrasear y a lo mejor unir lo que Sandrine y Karima nos acaban de decir. Porque Sandrine decía, tenemos que cambiar la narrativa de la gestión climática. Y Karima decía, tenemos que combatir esta idea de que en armonía podemos salir de manera colectiva. Normalmente, y eso lo vimos en la pandemia, cuando hay una crisis, lo que sucede con las naciones es que éstas se protegen a sí mismas, se enclaustran y entonces empiezan estas políticas de exclusión de los demás, ¿sí? Entonces, lo primero que yo les diría, volviendo a tu pregunta, es, bueno, tenemos que tener una visión colectiva de futuro para poder sobreponernos al cambio climático que ya es inevitable y que estamos sufriendo. Entonces, ser incluyentes no es, digamos, un acto de bondad hacia los que son más pobres o más marginales, sino es también un acto de sobrevivencia fundamental. Si no los incluimos, efectivamente, ya lo dijeron aquí nuestras colegas, simple y sencillamente, colectivamente, no vamos a lograr esa armonía humana que es necesaria para florecer como economías y como personas también, ¿no? Nos vamos a sumergir en crisis climáticas cuyos efectos sociales son inimaginables, porque hemos tenido crisis que afectan a miles de personas, a millones de personas, pero jamás a billones de personas, y las vamos a tener.
Muchas gracias, Rodolfo. Bueno, I'm going to give you the word, and if before you ask anything, just because you mentioned that at the end you were talking about the well-being economy. From the question is, how do you think we can shift narratives and mentalities toward the well-being economy that prioritizes nature, fairness, inequality reduction, participation, connection, dignity from the outset? And perhaps you also want to respond directly to what I see what Rodolfo was saying.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the beauty of what you and I experienced 3 weeks ago, and granted, Iceland is a small country, huh? It's the size of a small town. But the leader, the president, the entire time that she spoke about humanity, she spoke about a flourishing economy, she spoke about love. I mean, this is a president. At a time when we have presidents that are talking about hate, talking about fear, talking about everything else, talking about how big I can be, rather than how can we collectively act. And this is the problem, Rodolfo, and this is what I really see. Until 1 year ago, I had a lot of hope for us to move towards our SDG goals. We had conversations with a variety of different governments who wanted to become well-being economy governments. We had some of these open, human, thoughtful conversations about how do we shift not only the narrative, but the big systems, our economies, as well as how do we work with mayors and communities to bring people on this unbelievably exciting journey where we decide to prove Jane Goodall, some of you might know, the incredible scientist Jane Goodall, who said, we actually are our greatest threat.
Indeed.
People, humanity, are the most intelligent species, but they're not the wisest. And I said to Jane, but Jane, can we not be the wisest? We have to prove that we are wise, wise from the heart as well as wise from the head. And I think that was the beauty of this well-being economy gathering, was that all actors that participated, governments, people that were coming actually from the public health sector, NGOs, but businesses, etc., were all driven by that one ideal of how do we actually create a flourishing economy for more people. And so my worry, and this is why I bring the elephants in the room, because I think we need to wake up. Yesterday I participated in a debate around do we want consensus and do we have the time, or do we want authoritative governments to actually act in the area of climate change? And the authoritative governments, it was a debate. That side won. Because there is a great worry that consensus might take too much time. And yet we all know that consensus is fundamental because you need to bring more people on the journey. So how do we move forward? And part of that is our collective knowledge that we are going to have to stand up for that fairness. That we are going to have to stand up for that justice. Not only for ourselves, because let's be clear, Valencia taught us, and me in Belgium, Wallonia, where I am, where we also had floods 2 years ago, taught us that we are as weak as the weakest link, that we could all be refugees. This is no longer about us and them. This is about all of us. Our collective survival is dependent on prosperity for everyone. So it is hard at this time, when you hear such hate from some avenues and some leaders, to not get caught up in the fear and the hate. And the only way, and this was exactly the message from the forum and from the president of Iceland, is to hack love and humanity in every conversation you have, at the highest of levels, from the UN all the way through the community level. And that's what we're going to have to do.
Oh, indeed. Not an easy task, of course.
No, not an easy task.
Now, I come back to you, Karima, because you have a lot of experience with the Tamkin Community Foundation. You work on Moroccan public policy and local community initiatives. How do you think we can better include vulnerable communities in climate decision-making, so they actually participate in the final decisions, given, of course, that they're often the most affected by climate change and the least represented in the policy process?
I think I actually have 3 stories. I'll make them short, but they're all interconnected. The first story is the earthquake we had and the south of Morocco. It was a terrible moment. Many people died. But something happened in our society. It happened during the night, and as soon as people in Morocco heard what happened, the next day in the morning, there were queues of people to give their blood. Nobody told, nobody called. It was an immediate reaction. The second thing that happened is that there were self-organizing processes in every town where people were sending donations. And the city council was supporting that, providing the transport and the logistics, all the logistics. And so it was completely self-organized and supported. It was not even who's going to do what. It was really extraordinary. And everybody gave. From the highest level of the government and even the palace in Morocco to the people who had very, very, very little to give, but still came and gave. So in the midst of this catastrophe, we rediscovered ourselves as society. It was almost like a prism that allows us to see something that transcends social differences, economic differences, and we all came as one. And our neighbors, Spain, also were there with us. And other countries were there with us. And it was an extraordinary feeling. So, and I remember being in a village, and there were like 11 villages. So the members of 11 villages, we all sat outside in a circle. And the village that invited us was a village who was not affected, but was actually supporting the other villages who had very difficult to access. And we had this ongoing communication. The traditional social structures and organizations allowed to be able to have that resilience, to immediately respond, and to create conditions, not only for the community itself, but for support the other communities. We have this in us. We have this in us. And beyond that, the appreciation that in the midst of the terrible destruction that happened, life came also, because new sources of water revealed themselves. So I think it's our ability to be able to see it all. This is your invitation also, to see that, yes, everything that you said is there, but isn't it beautiful you have a president of a country who speaks love, the language of love? And this is something that we all recognize. We took it out of our schools, of our university, of our sciences, but at the end of the day, this is something that brings us together and profoundly defines us as humanity. This is the first story, so widening the gaze to be able to see it all. We do not fall into despair, because I want to be part of something that tells me, you're beautiful. I want to be part of something that tells me you belong. I want to be part of something that tells me together the field of possibilities are limitless. The second story, one of our team members, so I'm a board member of IMAL, which means future in the language of Amazigh, which is the indigenous people in Morocco. So we speak Arabic and Amazigh. A large percentage of the population speaks Amazigh. Amazigh means the free people, by the way. So IMAL, Initiative for Climate and Sustainability, is a think tank, trying to bring the perspective of Africa, of Middle East, of Morocco, because it got co-founded in Morocco, into the global discourse. One of our team members, Said, is part of this community called Azul. Not Azul, Athul, blue, but Azul meaning peace, Athul meaning peace in Amazigh. They are a nomadic community. We've had 8 years of drought. The This year was an exceptional year. It gives us hope, but the nomadic population decreased dramatically in Morocco, in the southeastern areas of Morocco, the mountains areas and the desertic areas. So his father is a nomad. He's a researcher in Imel, and he researches finance, climate finance. And he's seeing how many of the nomads in the communities have had to go to install themselves in cities. But others, because to be a nomad and to have a nomadic lifestyle, you are a symbol of adaptation. You live in the topography of the land and in the pulsation of the earth. So they have, and one of the questions they were asking, I said, okay, we see there's no longer water. There's no water in the land. Who took the water from the clouds? So this is another way of talking about climate. So I don't need to use scientific terms. The people know, they understand that this is something is not right. Because it's generational, it's ancient, social forms of life and knowledge. So they have brought in a member of a representation in the local community, in the local political community. But it's not enough. Because what the city council is saying, or the municipalidad, I don't know, municipality, yes, I'm getting confused with my languages here. Municipality are saying, okay, we understand what we need, you need, because we are part of this community, but we don't have the means. And this is why climate finance is important. This is why the focus on adaptation is extraordinarily important, and beyond that, damage and loss. Because they have lost their livelihoods, because sources of water have disappeared. It is heartbreaking when people are telling you from the south that please do not talk about the oasis. For you, it's romantic. It's the idea of beauty and the idea of water and paradise on earth. For us today, it represents death and destruction. The third story is, and very quickly, I'm sorry, Gustavo, am I taking too much time?
No, don't worry.
No, you're okay. The third story is witnessing that when young people, and there's every fiber of their being, feel that my value as a human being is not something I need to prove anymore. Actually, the very values, what is your value as a human being, is something I will no longer be able to understand. When my value is not extrinsic, is what you have in your pocket, is not intellectual, is not cultural, is not religious, is the mere fact that we're human beings and that we share humanity. When that happens, and we experience it in so many communities, when that happens, then those young people, there is an energy that liberates itself. There is a sense of belonging, not only to their village or to their neighborhood or to their country, a sense of belonging to a shared humanity. So when these young people meet with decision makers and with policy makers at a local or regional level, suddenly they meet something that they cannot, young people that they haven't met before. They look into the eyes of these young people and they look at new possibilities. And we have witnessed how the decision makers start calling them. We start including them and start encouraging them. So, because suddenly there is hope, suddenly there's no longer despair, suddenly this energy is contagious. And I think at that moment, that decision maker, who maybe was young and full of illusion and hope, and lost it, and became cynical, and started abusing the system, suddenly maybe start recognizing something that is still within himself. And this is where we witness and we experience what we call societal metamorphosis. Because when that happens in the village and in the school and the municipality, and when it happens in the faculty, and when you have all these metamorphic niches emerging, and when you have decision makers trying to reflect their own governance models in order to facilitate that, when governance becomes facilitating, then we experience emerging governance, beholding new properties, and beholding a property that talks not in terms of control, who has the power, that talks not in terms of resources, how are we going to use and where the resources, but actually breathes the very understanding that we are human beings and we are able to live in harmony and start reflecting and expressing what you were talking about, which is love and trust.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karima. In your first story on the earthquake reminded me of a very big earthquake we had in Mexico City. Rodolfo will remember in 1985, which devastated much of Mexico City with thousands of deaths. And indeed, like in the case you said, people, while the government was slow to react, people were already queuing to donate blood or to help take away the fallen, whatever had fallen from the earthquake and rescue people and so on. But not only that, and that's what's relevant, I also see to this point, not only to address the issue, the affectation of the earthquake, but many scholars, and I agree with them, think that this was part of contributed significantly to a change in perceptions in Mexico and ultimately to incorporate a much more democracy in the regime, because people said we can do it. And I'm thinking it caused me to reflect a bit on yes, we need a lot of changes in mindset to address climate change and to address our behaviors and ensure the policies are fine, institutions are working in this regard. And perhaps the problem is that these cases like the earthquake, people focus on the problem immediately. And the case of climate change is so many problems. So people, if there's big hurricane, people are going off to help, but you're not so you're looking at the effects of the hurricane, but not what's behind the hurricane, which is climate change. So we have to make a way to make sure that we're not addressing just the problem at hand, the immediate problem at hand, but the bigger issue that's causing all these more severe and frequent meteorological disasters and other factors. And I like very much the concept you talked about, social metamorphosis. It's very good. Thank you. We now have some moment. Tenemos ahora unos momentos para preguntas del público, por favor, en caso de haberlas. ¿Quería hacer una pregunta usted? No. Perdón. Usted no, pensé que no.
¿Hablo?
Sí, adelante.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Es no solo muy interesante, sino muy emocionante la presentación que nos han hecho. Sandrine ha mencionado el rearme y ha mencionado el odio, pero no la guerra. La guerra es una tragedia humana, sobre todo. Pero yo me pregunto, además de tragedia humana, ¿qué efecto climático tiene la guerra? Ucrania, Gaza, Sudán, etcétera. Todo ese abanico de guerras que tenemos por el mundo. Les hemos dicho a los líderes, a Putin, a Netanyahu, a quien sea en Hamas, el efecto climático, si es que realmente existe?
Very good question. Unfortunately, I think those leaders don't really care too much about the climate effect of warfare. The biodiversity loss and also infrastructural losses that we see from warfare, the direct impact in terms of what we call the positive feedback loops, the forests that are lost, the biodiversity is huge. If one of the scientists that wrote Earth for All with me is Johan Rockström, who's the most knowledgeable climatologist that's been working in this field and working on planetary boundaries. And when he talks about the planetary boundaries, he talks about the interrelated systems that we have, whether it be through our atmosphere, or whether it be through our biotopes. And the biggest problem that is not being discussed is that the more biodiversity we lose, and for the moment we are going backwards also in Europe in terms of nature restoration, the more capacity we lose to actually be a carbon sink. And this is the same problem that we're seeing in conflict zones. So the more we destroy the land, the more we destroy the forest, the more we destroy the biodiversity, the more capacity we lose in becoming a carbon sink. And that means that the impacts not only of our adaptation and for people to actually be able to be resilient to future shocks and stresses from climate change is very difficult, but also it just means that the country has less capacity to actually be that sink. I don't think there's enough analysis on it. On the other side, I also don't think there's enough analysis of how much climate change is creating conflict. So we know that the Syrian conflict is a conflict over water. We know that we will continuously have a shortage of water, which is going to enhance conflict between different neighbors, whether it be in the south or whether it be in the north. And so I'm very worried that this compound effect, and this is the systemic thinking that we try to bring in across our work, Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity, which, by the way, has been translated in Spanish as well, is very much not looked upon enough. And maybe if I can just add one final point, is that with more climate shocks, we will, and we already are seeing, increased social tension. We have put together a social tension index, which shows that it's not only because our well-being has decreased, and the other thing that was not mentioned about Iceland, by the way, is it's not just a president that talks about love, it's a president that puts in place an economy that works for people and the planet. The economics of what has been put in means that Iceland is #1 on the happiness index, even though they spend half of their time in the dark, and also on the Human Development Index. So we need to understand that the compound effects of both climate change, conflict, and the fact that we are continuing to promote an extractive economy is becoming a very negative feedback loop. So I think your question is pertinent, both in terms of the cause of increased conflict and the impact that conflict will have directly on increased climate emissions and a decrease in our capacity to actually buffer those emissions.
Could I add
Yes,
something
please, of
that
course.
actually I thank you so much for that question, because there are two elements. Obviously the climate, consequent climate change consequences and environmental disaster, and also that we are living exceptional times of crisis of humanity. So in this context, how do you trust our humanity and grow and water this relationship and this hope in order to together to face an existential threat for all? I actually was very curious with this question, so I did a bit of research. And did you know that the first 120 days of bombing of Gaza was the equivalent of the gas emissions of 26 countries for a year? The first 120 days. Who has spoken about that? This is a research done by Dr. Neymark, a senior lecturer in Queen Mary University, and Dr. Patrick Bigger. So he's saying the study highlights the need for comprehensive reporting of military emissions and an increased awareness of the climate impact of conflicts. But furthermore, we are witnessing today a genocide every day on our phones unfolding. And we are unable to stop it. What is that telling us? This is actually revealing what is going to happen when the situation of climate change is going to get out of control. And if we do not come together as one to say, stop, this is unacceptable, it's not even a question of Palestine. It transcends a people and ethnicity, it transcends politics, it transcends regions. At the time where we're all talking about existential survival, not only of the human beings on this planet, but life as a whole. Because, as you said, and it's so good that you said it, these tensions are not going to create more conflicts. So does that mean that if we have people whose homes, whose cities or countries are under the water, are we just going to bomb them? Because they're causing problems? Is that where we're going? By letting happen what is happening today? So we are really confronted to maybe a crisis of humanity like we've never met before, because we are all witnesses. It's not something that any of us can say we did not know. So thank you so much for the question. Yes, there is hope, there is a beauty, but also the responsibility to stop the conflicts in this world. We cannot stop climate change today, not tomorrow. We can adapt, and we can mitigate, we can transcend ourselves, but we can stop the conflict. It's within our hands.
Thank you. Rodolfo, you wanted to add something?
Sí, la pregunta efectivamente es muy pertinente, porque por mandato ningún organismo de Naciones Unidas, ni tampoco la OCDE, puede accesar estadísticas militares, ni procesarlas, ni recibirlas, ni ser depositarias de. Entonces no hay un disclosure de las actividades militares de ningún país. Entonces no sabemos pues cuántos tanques hay, cuántos aviones hay, cuál es el impacto o la huella de carbono de esas bombas, ¿no? O de los portaaviones. Eso no simplemente no lo sabemos, ni lo podemos saber, ni lo podemos ni siquiera preguntar. Entonces, lo que sí sabemos es que no hay tanques híbridos, ni campos de batalla resilientes, ¿no? Ni ejércitos que tengan como objetivo la neutralidad de carbono al año 2050. Eso sí lo sabemos con seguridad. Entonces, yo creo que ese es un problema global. Y voy a tomar este como ejemplo para hablar de algo que dice el reporte, que es la definición de un migrante climático, que no está todavía aceptada en Naciones Unidas y no existe. Existen esbozos de lo que es un migrante o un refugiado climático, pero no hay una definición que active los mecanismos de soporte financiero, tecnológico, de asistencia a un migrante climático. Entonces, por ejemplo, cuando un migrante de Centroamérica llega a la frontera con Estados Unidos y le preguntan a usted por qué viene aquí, no dice porque ya no puede producir alimentos en su país, dice, no, es que aspiro a tener una mejor condición económica. Si dijera, yo soy un migrante climático, ¿por qué? Porque vivía en este lugar ya no llueve, en este lugar hay temperaturas extremas, entonces en ese momento se debería de activar, ¿sí?, la categoría de refugiado y el país lo tiene que aceptar a ese migrante climático, y a ese migrante climático lo tendría que mantener no un país forzado a poderle dar asistencia, sino el financiamiento climático que está disponible para fenómenos como el de la migración climática. Entonces hay todavía algunas áreas, algunos hoyos negros en la complejidad climática que estamos viviendo que debemos de atender, y algunos los señalamos aquí en el reporte.
Sandrine, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the perversity because I so agree with you. And what's interesting is that actually it's the military that is increasingly highlighting that climate change is having an impact. There have been several reports by generals, by military leaders who are seeing climate change and who are seeing the impact on conflict. And yet the perversity is the fact that we know that conflict is also creating the emissions that you just stated. That's the first. The second, and this is where your point, Karima, is so important about us not being complacent. I keep on saying complacency is complicity. And it's really important that we as individuals, I am the granddaughter of an Auschwitz survivor, not because I am Jewish, but because my grandfather fought the resistance. And I have now been going through his videos, which he has dedicated to his grandchildren, to say, do not forget history. I bring this up because I know your question was more about the emissions from the military, but we need to realize that right now, coming from the United States, and by the way, I am Belgian, even though I grew up in the US, we are doing what I call the 5 M's. We are systematically enabling a monarchy to take control, not over just the United States, but other countries, dedicated to making more money on the backs of everyone else, absolutely everyone, focused on the increased military machine that they will be sending their military to the rest of the world, while Europe in particular has to defend itself and put in place its own defense budgets, also with a very clear focus on more materials and more molecules to fuel the AI revolution. And if we do not start to stand up and hold our leaders accountable, not only will climate be affected, but our own humanity, our existential risk will only get worse. Because the more we move towards AI, the more we move towards conflict, again, it becomes a vicious cycle of increased impact on climate change, biodiversity loss, and human loss. So I apologize for being a bit dark, because I think it's important, and it's not just the youth, it's all of us. I am, and I have to say it to myself, to remind myself, I am a grandchild of horror. But I'm also a grandchild of hope, because the European resistance and Europeans rebuilt Europe as a land of hope. And my other grandfather was also part of the European Commission. So I say this at a time when we are talking about the importance of recognizing how much destruction we are doing from climate impacts. But now this is becoming a much broader circle of impacts. It's not just about climate change. It is also about our humanity.
Yeah, and of course, another very important issue is that you're, for example, armed conflict, you're dedicating attention to it, resources to it.
Absolutely.
And you are not focusing, for example, on climate change or other, we see it now, for example, Europe rearming itself.
Yes.
Because of the current situation, and at a loss to international development, to
Rearming
change.
itself and buying arms from the United States.
Yes, so it's not just the effect of the conflict itself, but the indirect effect on climate change. Anyway, I think we are finishing now. Ya terminamos, no da tiempo para otra pregunta. Quería agradecer mucho a nuestros tres panelistas y expertos, André, Karima y Rodolfo, y por supuesto agradecer mucho a la Caixa. Este trabajo que presentamos hoy pues es producto de una colaboración estrecha que tenemos ya con la Caixa y que seguirá, espero, por muchos años. No sé, ¿quieres decir algo? Ya. Y bueno, pues si no, pues les agradezco a todos ustedes por haber estado aquí con nosotros este día, y pues los exhorto a leer el reporte y pues seguir participando en estos eventos. Muchas gracias.